war against the neighboring states. The Hungarian Republic of Councils tried to spread through a revolutionary war communism to Slovakia in 1919. As recent studies by Balázs Ablonczy shows, Hungarian authorities supported guerrilla activities in occupied Transylvania. The new counter-revolution government provided military assistance to Poland engaged in a life and death struggle with the Soviet Red Army. Hungary also provided refuge to Russian counter-revolutionaries such as General Denikin and to German right-wing assassins and terrorists. It fought indirectly a border war with Austria in 1921. The civil war in Hungary was one of the bloodiest in East Central Europe. Hungary was the only country east from Russia where communism was able to hold power. Communists were able to have power for an extended period of time. In Hungary too, peasant rebels, the so-called Green Cards, first represented a quasi-independent force. Unlike Makhno's Green Army in Ukraine, which first collaborated with the Reds, the peasant rebels from Central Hungary was on war footing with the Republic of Councils from the start. In the fall of 1919, they officially joined the counter-revolution. In fact, in December 1919, Ivan Helyas and his lieutenants entered the Pronai battalion. Like in Ukraine and Poland, the same individuals and groups could play very different roles in other conflicts. The very right-wing activists, which robbed and murdered Jews and executed Democrats and leftist activists in 1919, also fought against the invading foreign armies and participated in the successful militia uprising in Western Hungary in 1921. This overlapping of roles was already a source of embarrassment and confusion in the interwar period, and it has made the evaluation of the role of agents of violence difficult for historians and the public. This paper examines the use of legal and extra-legal violence during the Council of Republic and the counter-revolution. It seeks to answer the question, if at all, and to what extent, the White Terror could be considered a product of and a response to the communist atrocities. Well, there was something surprising about the sheer volume of violence and the intensity of violence in Hungary in 1919, 1920. Labor militancy was indeed on rise in Hungary as in other European countries before 1914. Yet there was no revolution of 1905 and no bloody repression which gave birth in Peter Holbig's term to deadly Marxism in Russia. As the memoirs of left-wing contemporaries such as Gyula Hai and Arpad Szélpa shows, the bourgeois youth in Hungary too became increasingly restless before the war. Yet, compared to Russia, the Balkan countries such as Serbia, Bulgaria, Western European countries such as Italy, Spain, and France, anarchism remained a relatively weak movement. It represented only a minor threat to Hungary and Austria. Anti-Semitism too was on the rise, especially among university students. The first students' militia was in fact established by the notorious anti-Semite Miklós Szemere at the turn of the century, among rural administrators, landowners, and among some liberal professionals. Yet no major pogroms and anti-Semitic excesses comparable to those which accompanied the Russian Revolution of 1905 or the Romanian peasant uprising of 1907 took place in Hungary before 1914. While other countries, such as Russia, deported hundreds of thousands of Jews from the frontier region to the east, Hungary accepted refugees in the first phase of the war. Austria-Hungary did not participate in the Balkan Wars, which could have brutalized the population before 1914. As a result of almost 50 years of nation and state-building efforts, brilliantly described by Peter Judson in his excellent survey of the history of the Habsburg Empire, the Hungarian state was modern, relatively modern, strong, and confident on the eve of the war. The main sources of political and ethnic violence after 1919 indeed should be sought in the war and in political and social development in its immediate aftermath. The number of strikes bread riots, anti-Semitic attacks increased rapidly in the final phase of the war and in its aftermath. This map should be a little bit changed as a result of recent works. The recent studies by Paul Hatos and Tomáš Révész have shown rapid demobilization of hundreds of thousands of brutalized and unruly soldiers posed a serious threat to law and order. It fomented chaos and led to violence, which the authorities, despite their increased readiness to resort to heavy-handed methods, failed to contain. The presence of brutalized soldiers, the retreat of the state, its loss of monopoly on the use of violence, the availability of weapons, general misery, and the influx of hundreds of desperate refugees from the neighboring occupied territories continued to fuel tensions and served as an important source of violence during the Council Republic and the counter-revolution. In this paper, however, I am mainly interested in the continuity between the Red and the White Terrors. In his classic works on the French and the Russian Revolution, Arnaud Maire argued that it takes two to make revolution, and counter-revolution is revolutions others have. Revolution and counter-revolution are bound to each other as reaction to bound to action. Newton's third law states that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Applied to political events, Newton's laws would suggest first reciprocity and then balance between the competing forces. So what role, if any, did revenge, the most obvious reaction to violence, play in the first stage of the counter-revolution? Surviving evidence suggests that revenge for personal injuries played only a minor role in the White Terror. About 20% of Paul-Prouna's officers reported physical abuse at the hands of Red soldiers and policemen. Significantly, none of these officers lost a close family members during the communist interlude. The high majority did not join the most infamous of the death squad to avenge past injuries. On the other hand, the great majority of farmers who had lost family members during the Red Terror did not join any paramilitary groups and showed no interest in vendettas. The victims and the perpetrators, in brief, did not simply switch position after August 1919. The temporal and spatial dimension of the Red and White Terrors only partially overlapped. The counter-revolution lasted longer. It claimed more lives than its counterpart, the Republic of Councils. This was also true, by the way, for Germany, Finland, Bulgaria. In the latter countries, the White Terror demanded between 3 and 10 times more lives than the Red and the Orange Terrors. Violence increased over time during the communist overload in Hungary, reaching its zenith in the final months of the regime's existence. On the other hand, legal and extra-legal violence peaked during the first month of the counter-revolution and declined rapidly after March 1920. Both the Red and the White troops committed horrendous crimes. Yet the right-wing paramilitary groups were responsible for more torture and more rape, and they dispatched their victims in a more cruel manner. In regards to spatial dimension, the Red Terror was mainly a provincial and rural phenomenon. You can see it put on the map here. Only a minority, about 6% of the identified victims of the Red Terror died in the capital. Political violence during the Republic of Councils devastated mainly Center Hungary. The Danube-Tisza watershed, or Duna-Tisza in Hungarian, which alone claimed about half of the victims. Center Hungary was followed by Northern Transdanubia and Northern Hungary. In regards to settlement types, the Red Terror claimed most victims in villages and small towns, followed by mid-sized towns. In contrast to political violence during the Council Republic, which had been heavily concentrated, the anti-Semitic violence in the fall of 1919 was more diffused. Almost 3/4 of attacks on Jews took place in the western part of the country, in Transdanubia. On the other hand, the center part of Hungary, Pest County in particular, was a center of political violence both during the Republic of Councils and the counter-revolution. The overlap, however, was far from complete. Half of the village and towns which suffered significantly from political violence in the spring and summer of 1919 also witnessed summary executions of Jews and anti-Jewish riots in the fall. Yet about the same number of towns and villages which had been quiet during the Council Republic became centers of anti-Semitic violence after August 1919. According to the moderate socialist Oskar Jászai, the terrorist actions of the Reds usually revealed the primitive cruelty of coarse and ignorant men. The Whites worked out a cold and refined system of vengeance and reprisal, which they applied with the cruelty of scoundrels masquerading as gentlemen. The worst atrocities of the Red Terror were usually the wild acts of depraved and semi-bestial proletarians. Those of the Whites were the deliberate actions of elegant officers. The social and cultural backgrounds of the agents of violence in the second and the third phase of the Civil Wars could not be more different. The rank and files and leaders of the two elite paramilitary groups, the Pronai and Ostenburg officers' companies, hailed exclusively from the middle class and the elite. Significantly, nobles and aristocrats were overrepresented among Pronai's men. Baron Paul Pronai was a sign of a distinguished and in the 19th century liberal family. He reminds me of Mihai Babic's poem. From his look, the words feints and his handshakes means slavery. Indeed, he was a very hardened man. Captain Gyula Ostenburg-Moravec too was an adopted son of a nobleman. The leaders of the local civic militias also came from the middle and upper classes. On the other hand, the rank and file of the local militias tended to be of lower class, mainly peasants and artisan regions. The white officers were well educated. With two exceptions, Pronai's officers finished high schools. Many of them were university students and university graduates. With a few exceptions, all members of the Pronai and Ostenburg officers' companies had been promoted to officer ranks only during the war. The majority received decorations for bravery, and a handful of them could be considered national heroes. There were more women in the white units, employed mainly as informers. The white units were well embedded in Hungarian society. In the fall of 1919, they enjoyed widespread middle class and elite support, including that of women. Their actions initially met with at least a partial approval of the middle class and the elite, particularly in the provinces. These pictures relate to mass executions in Kaposvár. On the other hand, the Red militias recruited their members from the lower classes. Both the leaders and the rank and files of the Red militias, such as the Lenin boys seen in these pictures, came almost exclusively from the working class. There were only a handful of peasants in the elite Red units. The leaders and the rank and files of the militias were poorly educated. Only one of them had a high school diploma. On the other hand, none of them were illiterate. So by and large, they were more educated than the rural population at the beginning of the 20th century. All of them served in the war. Unlike white officers, however, the members of the Red paramilitary groups had been conscripted as infantrymen and sailors rather than hussars, pilots, or rangers. The pilot is very important here. Unlike the leaders and the rank and file of the white officers detachment, none of the Lenin boys had been promoted to officers' ranks during the war. Refugees were overrepresented in both the red and the white units. Unlike the Czech or the Soviet Czech or the political police, the Lenin boys, however, were ethnically homogeneous. Jews were overrepresented in the red militias, but their share did not exceed the percentage of the Jewish population in Budapest, the town from which the majority of the rank and files hailed. The differences in social and cultural backgrounds and political orientations of the rank and file notwithstanding, there was some similarity between the leaders of the red and the white terrors. This could be shown in when we look at the personality types and the motivational structures of Ivan Helyas and Tibor Samueli, the political commissars for military affairs. Both of these men were unscrupulous individuals. They were careerists, soldiers of fortune of the worst sort, and sadists. They were also dandies who lived beyond their means and used violence to enrich themselves and promote the careers of their family members. The social background of the victims of the white terror, of the two phases and the red terror, was also different. The lower middle class seems to have suffered most both during the red and the white terrors. The red militias targeted the members of the upper class and the elite more often, about 1/3 than the white troops. Within the middle class, the red troops killed more civil servants and landowners. The white militias, on the other hand, targeted liberal professionals such as doctors, artists, merchants, teachers, and Jewish estate managers. The share of lower class victims was 3 times higher during the counter-revolution than during the communist interlude. The red terror did not single out Jews as an enemy. The right-wing militias, on the other hand, systematically targeted Jews both for ideological and financial reasons. Women, finally, were more likely to fall victims to the white than to the red terrors. Some of them were kidnapped, like these 2 ladies on the picture. Others were raped during pogroms. Still others were sexually assaulted in internment camps and military prisons. This is very important here, this picture of camps. In contrast to the white terror, the red terror, the better part of violence during the white terror took place in various forms of prisons. And the majority of sexual assault also took place in what the historians called in total institutions. In other words, neither the red or the white terror could be reduced to struggle between the haves and the have-nots, or between the bourgeoisie and the working class. The red terror could also be seen as a conflict between urban consumers and rural producers, between the city and the countryside. The white terror, on the other hand, was as much an intra-class conflict, a struggle between different middle-class groups, than it was an inter-class war. The communist experiment was not a Jewish attempt to take over the state and enslave the Magyar population, as many conservative and right radical commentators like to believe. The white terror, on the other hand, did have a strong ethnic and religious dimension and touched the life of the majority of Hungarian Jews. Militia and mob violence during the counter-revolution was also more systematic and more purposeful. Male students and student militias wreaked havoc on the university campuses in order to attract public attention and gain elite support. The ultimate goal of student activists was to put pressure on academic administrators to prevent the enrollment of Jewish students and put pressure on lawmakers to pass legislation favorable to their interest. Student violence thus became part and parcel what Christian Ungváry has called the ethnicization of social policy in Hungary. With the passing of the numerous clauses legislation in September 1920, this strategy was for the first time crowned with success. Finally, violence, as my good friend Szilárd Borbe used to say, was born in the heart and soul of people and was a cultural phenomenon. The members of the Red and White detachments were men of actions, not men of words and ideas. Yet, they did view the world through the prism of political culture. What is fascinating about the political culture of the Red and White militias of its international nature. The Red militias, especially the de facto leaders such as Tibor Samueli, were motivated by Peter Holtby's term, by deadly Marxism, characterized by a fanatical hatred of the existing social and political order and its representatives, and a messianistic belief in the coming of a new and better world. Political language, I'm interested in the overlaps in political language as well. The white militias were also part of an international right-wing subcultures. So brilliantly described, by the way, by Robert Gerwart in one of his books. The basic elements of which, such as political paranoia, an injured sense of national pride, the faith in the resurrection of nations through violence, elitism, contempt for the masses, a violent form of masculinity, and last but not least, the belief in the existence of a worldwide Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy, analyzed beside Robert Gerwart by Paul Hannabrick, Attila Polk, and more recently by Peter Tschunderlich, could be found in every country in Europe from Russia, Poland, and Germany. These images are actually quite interesting. This is not Sammy Davis Jr., by the way. It's a Belarusian counter-revolutionary picture, and the language, the portrayal of red terrorists as Jews and animals. The elements of this imaginary, this language could be found in every country in Europe. This is a German billboard about Jewish responsibility for the First World War, and here is its Hungarian counterpart. So the element of this counter-revolutionary, right-wing counter-revolutionary culture could be found in every country, from Czechoslovakia to Poland to Russia and Germany. However, this ideology served as a source of motive mainly in the loser states. Finally, violence served different ends. The Red Terror was to realize the dreams of a world revolution and a new international order based on communist ideas. The White Terror, on the other hand, was mainly about national revival. Now, let me finish the course, the presentation on a lighter tone. To conclude, despite some of their shared origins and experience in the First World War and in the post-war chaos, and the obvious similarities in form, the Red and White Terror represented two very different brands of violence. Their similarities could be attributed to what biologists call a parallel evolution, when independent species acquire similar characteristics while evolving together at the same time and in the same ecospace. A platypus, here it is, a Kacsacsőrű emlős in Hungarian, despite its beak, is a mammal, is a mole, and not a bird, not a dog. The Red and White Terror had different sources, worked through different agents, evolved at different pace, and had produced different results. They also had a very different afterlife after 1921. But this would be a topic for a different presentation. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Béla Bedó for this very interesting insights into the troubled chapter of Hungarian history. And I will try to connect to our colleague Tamás Révész, also from the Trianon 100 research group. Tamás, can you hear me?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. We also try to accommodate to this new situation, so just need a minute of patience. And so in my presentation, I'm trying to connect to the previous topic. It's a little bit of a prehistory. I will talk about the two heroic borderlands, quote unquote, from the collapsed Habsburg Empire, namely Transylvania, Eastern Hungary, and Carinthia in the southern parts of today Austria. And what I try to do in my presentation is somehow compare the mythologies developed during the interwar period about the borderland conflicts in these regions of 1918-1919, and try to contrast the main elements and tropes of this mythology with primary sources. Basically, there are three main elements which I try to investigate here. The first is about the collapse of 1918, the collapse of the empires, and the kind of narrative tradition of an ungrateful homeland welcoming the returning heroic soldiers from the front line. The second one is about the resurrection, the national awakening in this heroic borderlands, the idea of a national mobilization of this period. And the third one is a kind of narrative or mythology about the special characteristics of these territories, namely the provincial unity in Carinthia and the special sacred warrior culture in Transylvania. The main aim of the presentation is not necessarily to challenge these mythologies, but rather to show what were the basis of these mythologies, how they developed, and what were the real experiences which were reinterpreted by the war veterans in the interwar period, and how they developed this kind of special warrior subcultures about these wars. So let's start with the first element of the mythology, the ungrateful homeland. Following the traditions of the European narrative tradition of the military defeat, the culture of defeat, 1918 generally, and at the end of the First World War, was narrated by the right-wing veterans as the moment of total military collapse, the kind of lowest point of the national history, when basically every previous value was destroyed by the revolution, and the army was totally collapsed by treason, mainly by treason, and basically anti-militarism, anti-masculinity ruled the streets and ruled the public. And this treason led to the paralysis of a society which wasn't able to kind of resist to the enemies of the nation, either internal, external enemies. In our case, in this multi-ethnic borderlands, mostly the neighboring countries, so the South Slavic and the Romanian state. Interestingly, so if we are looking to the primary sources of 1918 and the homecoming of the Habsburg army, what we can see is a very similar phenomenon to the German developments of that period, namely that those soldiers who returned disciplined or relatively disciplined in close formation by train, they were greeted relatively positively by the local elites of the towns and the different counties. Basically, there was same choreography in both both of these regions, and therefore I put the main square of Klagenfurt and the main square of Oradea or Nagyvárad in the right side of my slide, because these were the places where the soldiers were greeted mostly by the mayor of the town, the leaders of the new national councils, and the military commanders. And the general narrative used in the speeches by these political leaders were very traditional. They were mostly praising the sacrifice and the heroism of the local soldiers, and talking about their heroic deeds. So it wasn't really an anti-militaristic or pacifistic or revolutionary kind of narrative, but rather the continuation of this local tradition, the local bond or local narrative traditions between the local regiment and as a pride of the region and the local elite. So it was rather like a late 19th century, early 20th century narrative, continuation of this narrative. Of course, the new and interesting fact that in some of the cases in these multi-ethnic places, even the nationalities or the former ethnic minorities were involved in these greetings. In the case of Oradea, for example, the homecoming convoy regiment was greeted by the local Romanian council as well in Romanian language, emphasizing their service to the local community. Of course, there was not only just praising and local welcoming of the homecoming troops, but also a massive attempt to mobilize some of these homecoming soldiers, not only demobilize, but remobilize as well, in order to maintain, quote unquote, order in the regions. Order, which they mostly mean, or they interpreted the order as or maintaining the order as a fight against the green cadres. So basically those soldiers who were not disciplined, but rather participating in the massive riots mentioned already by Béla Bodo in his previous lecture. So against these riots, there was a massive attempt of remobilization by the local communities and the town municipalities. And what we can see here is this chart shows the number of soldiers in Carinthia mobilized in 1918, 1919. And what we see is that during 2, 3, 4 weeks of November 1918, there was a massive remobilization of which I called old units, which were the former K&K, so common infantry regiments. So basically, the reserve battalions were remobilized by the local municipalities in order to do this kind of local peacekeeping duties, as well as some of the new recruits were mobilized as well. And what we can see is there was two main elements or two main groups or the two main origins of these new coming soldiers. One of them, as I already mentioned, were actually the soldiers of local regiments, mostly older soldiers, reserve soldiers, who were already in the home front to the end of the war. They were either demobilized or used for kind of peaceful, in reserve duties. And the choreography was very similar in both borderlands. These units were raised mostly in the garrisons nearby the town center by the commanders of the local units. Calls were published in the newspapers, and basically the local, I would say, older middle class people joined these peacekeeping formations. The second major type of mobilization happened actually in November 1918, was a kind of paramilitary mobilization. This was not conducted by military formations, but rather by civilian institutions, which were militarized during the First World War. And one of the most interesting one were actually the schools, high schools or universities, where the older classes were joined these policing forces, these National Guard forces, in one unit, mostly led by their own teachers or professors. This was the case in Klagenfurt. This was the case in Cluj as well, where the university students formed their own battalions. And this was actually nothing else than the same reaction to the crisis as it was happened in 1914. So basically, paramilitary self-mobilization of the schools was a continuation of a wartime tradition, using these young men to kind of military supporting duties. What a new phenomenon, or a rather new phenomenon, was the mobilization of the trade union the trade unions and the socialists. And I find it very interesting because mostly we consider Eastern Hungary, Transylvania, as well as Carinthia as a rural agricultural land, but in fact there were the presence of the social democratic trade unions was relatively massive, and in certain places, industrial centers like the Zsiu Valley, the mining region, actually the social democratic trade unions armed themselves and took over all the policing duties from the gendarmeries. So basically, organized workers, railway workers, or miners were mobilized in these first weeks of November 1980. If we move to the second part of my presentation, the second type of borderland mythologies, which were very similar both in Carinthia and in Eastern Hungary, this was the idea of a heroic national borderland. The heroic national borderland, where actually this national awakening from the lowest point started, and this national awakening was initiated or started or provoked by former Habsburg military officers. So they were, as the elite veterans of the nation, somehow had possessed the power and the moral credit which allowed them to mobilize the local population. And they mostly connect this kind of resurrection to a certain event. In the case of Carinthia, the Battle of Grafenstein in the 15th of December 1918. In the case of Transylvania, a kind of recruitment tour in the beginning of December 1918, which was the moment of this national awakening, or starting moment of this national awakening. But also very similar and very interesting is how they framed this idea of a military frontier and the special characteristics of this military frontier population. This basically a continuation of a pre-war tradition, that these frontier people, this population of these regions, are somehow the elite, the true carrying the true values of the nationhood. I put this picture on the slide because there is a beautiful description by István Zágony, a Transylvanian journalist who wrote a novel which somehow describes this awakening process as a train journey, when the Hungarian officers leaving the foggy, corrupted, gray city of Cluj and entering the nice snowy fields of Transylvania, secular lands, where the true Hungarians are living and carrying the virtues of the nation. And it's very similar in Carinthia, where actually the treason of Vienna and the Red capital city was often contrasted with this kind of truly mountainous, truly German virtues of the peasant population, and also connected well to other, the help of other heroic borderlands, right? For example, Tyrol. So if we go back to the chart I shown before, we can see that actually this middle of December moment in Carinthia, which was supposed to be awakening the population, was actually the lowest point of the mobilization. There was an initial first phase of mobilization in November, and the second one in the beginning of January, which was actually the starting of the real fighting in the region. So it seems to be that this kind of awakening effect was rather more a narrative construction than a reflection to the reality. In the case of Carinthia, this kind of abandoned frontier warrior mythology could be also problematic if we look at the social background of the soldiers fighting in this war. The vast majority of them were truly Carinthians, more than 80% of them. But what's striking to me is that about 5%, so the third highest number, came from Lower Austria and Vienna, supposedly red, corrupted regions of Austria, and only 2% from Tyrol. But due to this kind of narrative tradition of heroic borderlands, this small participation of the Tyrolean soldiers vastly overwrought the participation of any other non-Carinthian soldiers in the conflict. In the case of Transylvania, the idea of this Székely recruitment tour is also rather problematic. If we're looking at the map, that's the region where should be this massive mobilization took place. But in fact, about half of, or most likely less than half of the division, or the Székely division, came actually from this area. So this kind of national awakening was most likely just partly originating from this agrarian land. Instead of these regions, most of the soldiers were raised in this relatively large part of Eastern Hungary, Western Transylvania, which was a multi-ethnic region populated by Romanians and Hungarians, but mostly Romanians. And there, actually the mobilization was rather kind of banal. The local peacekeeping units, which I mentioned before, which were mobilized in November 1980, and the local KMK regiments, the 12, the 32, the 21, these units were actually incorporated in this division during the retreat of the Hungarian troops in the winter of 1919. And basically, most of the soldiers are coming from this kind of background. Many of them were actually not rural, but rather urban soldiers. If we move to the third part of this borderland mythologies, till this point, the mythology of the two regions were very similar. We see very similar narrative elements in both cases. But there is a major difference between the two mythology, and that's how the resistance and the fight was framed. In the case of Carinthia, there is the national, or the war was narrated as a sign of an overarching provincial unity between the local Slovenes and the local Germans. So basically, there is an ethnically, if you wish, inclusive mythology with a lot of problems with that, but in theoretical terms, they are talking about the cooperation of the two nations. Contrary to that, in the Hungarian case, the mythology is praising, or the narrative is mostly concentrating on the heroism of the secular or the Székely soldiers. So it's a very exclusive mythology, excluding not only the local Romanians or the local non-Hungarian ethnic groups, but also those Magyars who did not born in this particular area of Transylvania. So on the one hand, there is an ethnically inclusive, the other hand, in an ethnically exclusive mythology. If we look at the case of Carinthia, we can see on the left-hand side a map showing how the conscription worked during the First World War. It's a rather even distribution of the soldiers, but the vast majority of the soldiers were recruited during the First World War from the northern parts of the country, or the province, which are mostly populated by Germans. If we compare it with the Kettner-Kreuz recipients, so those who participated in the Carinthian borderland war, we can clearly see that the vast majority of them are coming from the southern part of the eastern part of Carinthia, where actually, and this yellow arrow shows, where actually the Slovenian forces entered the region. So they were born very close to the fighting. And the northern, mostly German parts are vastly underrepresented in the statistics. So what we can see here is a kind of local mobilization, reaction to the beginning of the fighting. The local mobilization of the local communities, largely, by the way, based on the traditions developed in 1915 against the Italian invasion or the Italian threat during the First World War. So this kind of Freiwillige Schützen tradition was used to mobilize the local village communities in the region. And of course, where this kind of Windisch myth that the local Slovenes are fighting together with the Germans come from is that actually this is the region which is the most multi-ethnic, where the most of the Slovenes of the region were living. So it was, I would say, not necessarily a provincial unity, but kind of local community unity, which included a lot of Slovene or Slovene-speaking communities, and that's one example for that. That's the Hambier company from Rosenthal. That's in the southern part of the province. Here, 85% of the company's staff spoke Slovene language. We don't know what were their mother tongue or what were their ethnic or national identity, but we can surely say that the vast majority of them were actually from a multi-ethnic background. If we look at Hungary, the Hungarian case, there are very similar developments which can be found about this local mobilization. This is Bihar County, which is today Eastern Hungary and Western Romania. And what we can see here is on the left-hand side that the northwestern part of the county was the vastly Hungarian part of the region. But actually, the effective mobilization was taken place either in the center, so in Oradea, and in the eastern part of the region, where actually, again, the fighting were taking place. We have a lot of sources indicating that those Hungarian villages, which were surrounded by mostly Romanian population, these Hungarian villages joined the units, their stationing units, formed their own paramilitary guards, and tried to mobilize the population. While the northern, far away from the front-line regions remain mostly passive. Of course, the question remains open: were there kind of overarching ethnic unity in the region? So Romanians joined. Did the Romanians join the Hungarian units, or non-Hungarian ethnic groups join these Hungarian forces? The answer is, I think, yes and no. We don't really have sources about ethnic Romanian groups joining the Hungarian forces, but there were other groups who did that. This picture was taken in the southern regions of today Hungary, a small village called Totkomlos, and these soldiers are actually ethnic Slovaks. They are the flag which they are carrying has a Slovak script on it. Long live the National Party, the Slovak National Party, and they are joining the Hungarian Red Army. So what we can see is the local kind of mobilization could override ethnic principles in Hungary as well, in a case of these Slovak groups, for example. If I turn to the conclusion, what I think we can say about these borderland mobilizations, both in Carinthia and in Transylvania, that despite the mythology or despite the interwar narratives emphasizing the national mobilization, the national character of this mobilization, actually the military remobilization happened or could be described with two terms: locality and continuity. Locality because there were mostly limited remobilization by local communities. So not entire regions were mobilized or not entire provinces, but rather village communities or town communities were able to raise paramilitary guards to defend their immediate homeland. And this was mostly the aim of these limited mobilizations rather than bigger or larger national issues. And continuity because in many cases, this was the continuation of a wartime mobilization. First of all, in many places, there was actually a lack of demobilization. Many KMT regiments, or at least the skeletons of the KMT regiments, continued to exist in these borderland regions and continued to do their duties after the collapse of the Habsburg Empire. And the methods how the new soldiers were raised was also a continuation of earlier traditions. As John Horn calls it, the first mobilization of 1914, so the kind of civilian mobilization was repeated again with the mobilization of schools and university students. And there was also a continuation of a second mobilization from 1916. The kind of growing strength of the trade unions could be observed. So I would say it was more likely a traditional than a national mobilization. And if we just, as a last slide, turn back to the mythologies and what is the relationship to these results to the mythologies, we can see that in the similarity of the mythologies could be traced back to the similar experiences of the veterans in both cases. And of course, the similar interpretation according to their pre-war mindset. So they see Transylvania and Carinthia as a heroic borderland because of this national discourse about the borderland people started in the late 19th century. But of course, they reinterpreted their experiences in 1918, 1919 according to the different post-war situations. Because of the success of the Carinthian defense for the Kettner Abwehrkampf, the Carinthian nationalists did or created an inclusive narrative, included the Slovenian population in the region in order to kind of create a new culture of victory inside the general Austrian culture of defeat. While in Hungary, the loss of Transylvania did not allow to kind of create an overarching ethnic narrative saying that not only Hungarians joined the armed forces to defend against Romanians, but rather a more exclusive narrative focusing exclusively on the sacred soldiers of Transylvania, were symbolizing the national resistance. And in this sense, these traditional mobilizations were differently reinterpreted as national mobilizations. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tamás, for your interesting presentation. And we already got some questions, but there will be a discussion after the third presentation, which is Ivan Jelicic from the University of Rijeka, and also a member of the ERC Nepostrans project, with his presentation In the Name of the True Fiumians, Autonomous Democrats as Challengers to Local Elite Nationalistic Logics. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello to everyone from Budapest. So let's try to start on time. I'll share with you the PowerPoint. I apologize to the people in the room or to the people who are in the virtual audience, because I'll try to speak or to the virtual audience or to the real audience, and someone will be neglected. If you see me on the video camera, but you don't see me on the video camera, so there is no one will be neglected, maybe the audience, the real audience. Okay, sorry. So my presentation will be, it's entitled In the Name of the True Fiumians, Autonomous Democrats as Challengers to the Local Elite Nationalistic Logics. It's part of our work package, Elites and Challengers of the ERC Nepostrans. Basically working on the notion as elite as a group of individuals, as individuals or groups that have disproportional amount of wealth, privileges, political power, or skill in a society. And I think, as you will see, that these autonomous democrats, or at least some of them, could be understood as members of an elite, if not of a political elite, but challengers in the sense challengers to the political elite, even though themselves, some of them had, let's say, kind of disproportional skills or disproportional power in this local society. Now I'll try in 3 minutes to give you a really, short summary of what was happening in town, and to be as fast as I can in order to understand the local context. So basically, after the disappearance, the downfall of the Hungarian state institutions in Hungary, there was the creation of in Hungarian state institutions in Fiume, there was a creation of two rival national councils. I'll tell you something more about them later. These two rival national councils had different views of what should be the future of the city, one in favor of the annexation to Italy, the other in favor of the annexation of the city to the South Slav state. Different armies came into town. The most, let's say, the troops which outnumbered at the end in this occupation were the Italian troops. Also, this officially inter-allied occupation was led by an Italian general. So as you can probably imagine and conclude, the Italian National Council was the local elite which was privileged and remained in power in town. However, there were frictions between these two different political groups. There were violent incidents which resulted with the death of French troops, actually French colonial troops. So poor innocent victims of all this national struggle between the imagined Italian group and the imagined South Slav group, well, Vietnamese soldiers. But basically, I mean, what happened is that in a moment where it appeared that the city will become internationalized, the Italian poet and Italian hero of war, Gabriele D'Annunzio, entered in town. He remained in the city until the end of 1920. Then he was forcibly removed in a short conflict between his legionnaires and Italian troops. This was the moment when, thanks to basically the reached agreement between the Italian state and the Kingdom of SCS, an independent state. Well, the independent state was created. This independent state existed on the paper basically until the end of 1923, but de facto basically it was a state which suffered of a big degree of violence and internal conflict between pro-Italian annexationist groups and independentist group. So after this really short summary, let's come to I would say the main point of this presentation. This is actually the question, could we talk only about a polarized political scene in the sense of two different rival national groups which are fighting for the annexation to the respective imagined states? Is there a sense to speak only and simply about a perspective of national liberation, and what actually did the Habsburg past disappear, and was there a kind of radical rupture with the Habsburg past? As I see that among our viewers, there is Dominique Ryle. I mean, you'll have definitely the possibility to read more about how the Italian National Council was actually reusing these Habsburg institutions in order to keep its position and to maintain its followers. But I would say from a political perspective, this is not what I'm trying to say right now. The interesting thing here is to say, well, of course, there was a group that you can imagine was against this nation-state logic, and these were the socialists. I'll not say too much about them because they could be labeled as a kind of usual suspects in the sense that they supposedly should be internationalists. So it's not so awkward that in the moment when two rival national councils were forming, there was a workers' council that, led by the socialists, at the end asked for a creation of an independent republic for the city. But the group I'm trying actually to concentrate on is this group here, the group which was led by Ruggero Gottardi. A local patriciate family guy, son of a sea captain, a retired Habsburg cavalry lieutenant, and a merchant figure which was politically unengaged until November 1918. He had family networks through Hungary and links with Croatia, Slavonia, in the sense that his family 200 years before these events from Trentino moved to Budapest, had some was a kind of state officials, then moved to Fiume, a branch at least of this family. But the interesting thing is that what Gottardi did is that on November 15, he published an open letter to the, let's say, entire citizenship. In this open letter, he stated that the Italian National Council was an illegitimate representative of Fiume's population. Moreover, he was saying that these people who claim to represent the population are liars, since, and I quote basically his document, nobody was thinking of an Italian mother nation until the break of Hungarian state institutions. Moreover, entering in a kind of polemic with his cousin, who was a member of the Italian National Council, Gottardi is saying that our grandfathers, their grandfather, was the founder of the Croatian Reading Circle and also the member of the Patriotic Casino. He was the political loyalty of our elders, no politics, but living in peace with everybody. one can all basically say, I mean, that this anti-political stance is still a political stance for Gotardi. Gotardi had a kind of political stance, and I'll say something about this later. But the point was that actually in the moment when Serbian troops enter in town, and when probably the most realistic option was that the city will become part of Yugoslavia, South Slav state, or briefly Yugoslavia, is, I mean, that Gotardi had an alternative vision to the Italian National Council, but this alternative vision was not actually an vision that was against a kind of Italian notion against the Italian cultural background of the local society. As you can read here, basically, what Gotardi was claiming in his letter was, Fiumian real patriots, let's unite. Italian, Slavs, and Hungarians of Fiumian fathers, let's declare ourselves united under our Fiumian flag, free citizens of Italian language, under the Slav protection, but protected by our autonomy from the entire world. We are the natural outlet for Slavs and Hungarians. We will live in peace with everybody, banning any politics and sure of our sacred liberty. In this way, we will become a rich and joyful city. Here is the only path. So what I would say here is important is that in this moment, in November 1918, Gotardi is putting above everything still autonomy. So autonomy is quite more important above the notion of nation. Also, another important element in his narrative is economic development. So the notion of maintaining a kind of economical background is more important than being part of a nation state, in the sense of a state which allegedly shares the same kind of national culture. But on the other hand, it should be here pointed out that he is still maintaining a kind of national perspective, in the sense that this notion of autonomy is a notion of kind of, as I will show you later, of an idea of having a kind of different notion of self, of how can I put it, of different self-understanding, I would say. So this is actually the point. We can see in Gotardi from this letter a kind of Fiumian self-understanding, and also the identification of the population in this sense. It should be pointed out that so he was not so much interested in politics. Also from other sources, it's evident that he wants that the former MP in Budapest, Zanella, becomes the leader of this faction. However, this leader here was more interested in that moment for fighting for the annexion of the city to Italy, even though, and I don't have the time to speak about this other figure, but even though this figure will change basically his political views with the changing of the events. This is Gotardi's letter in November 1918. You could imagine basically that this is like an isolated case, that he's an eccentric figure who is thinking to speak only in his name, but actually he gained some supporters, and I'll tell you a little bit more later about his supporters. But it's interesting so that in July 1918, he actually also managed to send a proposal to the peace conference, and his proposal, you can read some of the features of this basically this idea of a creation of an independent state between Italy and the South Slav state. But I would point out here, besides this economical view of a territory which can be so large in order to function as an outlet for a larger hinterland, basically. It's interesting also this Gotardi view, which is expressed in one of the party congress, the idea that all these places which were former part of Cisleitania and Transleitania, these coastal parts, that in all these places the majority speaks, if not Italian language, the Fiumian dialect. So the idea that this could be viewed, this area around, which was under different administrations, could be viewed as one regional unit, let's say. Also in the party congress, we see other interesting elements that are mentioned. For instance, someone is claiming at the party congress that the party program is the purest socialism, not unhealthy communism. So the notion that the capitalist is bounded to the proletarian, the Fiume as a free port should be that different facilities should be given to private owners, and then these private owners should cede their gains to the city. Also, they are completely, against any kind of import and export taxes. It's basically a kind of really liberal view, but one should still liberalistic view, but one should still point out that it's not an unnational view. What I was trying to do during my research, departing basically from this rough estimate of the division of the population, here I quote the PhD thesis of William Klinger. Basically, one could say that more or less the population of the city was divided in three different political groups. So 1/3 more or less, which was in favor for the annexation of the city to the South Slav state, 1/3 which was in favor of the annexation to Italy, and 1/3 which, as you can see, overwhelmingly led by the socialists, but still 1/3 which was in favor for an independent solution. So my question was actually from this party Congress meetings that were published in Italian in a Croatian daily language, since the Italian daily languages didn't want to publish anything about Gottardi unless they were not criticizing his movements. What I basically did through the list of these people was trying to figure out at least the board structure or the direction members. So after creating a database and comparing these names with list of electors, Fiume population records, then a source which is quite interesting, even though, let's say, somehow it goes beyond this time period, but at least it's nominal, through fascist state police records, birth records, and then potential obituaries, actually to answer to the question to whom was Gottardi talking to, or who were actually the people Gottardi was representing. And here you have basically a sketch of the direction of the so-called true Fiumians. First of all, what you see is that the element of legitimization of this group is rather the notion of Fiume electors instead of nationality. Fiume electors means the people who had the right to vote according to the previous Hungarian laws. But what could be argued here is that their notion then of Fiumian was somehow connected to the economic, well, it had economic limitations, in the sense that the previous restrictions to obtain Heimatrecht, which was necessary to vote on local elections, and the limited right to vote because you had to pay a certain amount of taxes, at least for, well, rather elections. Sorry, I lost myself a little bit here, but the point was actually to say that it was definitely a quite limited amount of people who could be considered part of this political community according to the previous laws. Before analyzing this part of the direction board, this, I think, interesting elements about direction board, let me just read this part, which I think it's quite interesting. So the most renowned Gottardi followers were Oskar Battestin and Erminio Leubesberger, listed as secretary and treasurer of the Autonomist Democratic Party in August 1918. Erminio Leubesberger, a bank collector of Italian mother tongue, was arrested by the Fiumian police in May 1918 for distributing left leafs and gathering signatures in favor of an independent solution for Fiume. Fiume, a free city protected by England and America, we are against the annexation to Italy. Charged for Yugoslav propaganda, in the police record, Erminio Leubesberger gave a significant statement behind the logic of the new party. I had to add to my statement that I was never a follower of the Yugoslav party, since I'm of strong Hungarian autonomist feelings. This guy, who is probably related to the merchant owner, former city council member and philanthropist Benedetto Leubesberger, was not doing anything rather than following the pre-war attitude of Fiume's elite: autonomy inside Hungary, not membership inside an Italian nation state. His social background was quite similar to that of the Autonomist Democratic Party secretary, Oskar Battestin, a wood trader, son of Giovanni, one of the owners of Fiume's first parquet factory. besides this good economic background of Battistini, he was also married to Cornelia de Benzoni of Fiume patriciate origins. A considerable economic and social background were not only privileges of these two members, of the secretary and the treasurer. As honorary president was elected the Baron Luigi de Thierry, former president of Fiume court. Though he was old at that time, holding most of that honorary title, he also strived for party's cause. According to Lajos Egan's diary, under the guidance of Thierry, 950 Fiume's electors sent a request to Paris asking for the internationalization of Fiume, opposing Italian annexation. So basically, what you can see here is that there are kind of elements, interesting elements that define this, at least, direction of board. Their professions and social status, so that they are maybe somehow linked to the older patriciate, or that they are traders and that they have some connection with maritime related businesses. They are almost all of them were born in Fiume, but I will also point out these two interesting elements in their legitimization or in the building of the view of this political group. And this is more or less age and sex. Age, because they are more or less an older generation. As you can see, the majority of them is born in the 60s. The exception is Gottardi and Battistini, and they are all male. And from the party congress, it's interesting that they, for instance, say that the women of Fiume are passionate for Italian soldiers, so they're seeing as females are as unable to become actually electors. It's interesting that in this congress, they actually are against elections which were planned to be organized by the city council, because in these elections, women and 80-year-olds would participate. And speaking not only about the age of these figures, it's interesting that in the party congress, they also say that the active right to vote should be limited to, should start from 21, while the passive right to vote should start from 30 years old. As one of the party congress said, our population demonstrated a complete lack of political understanding. It is absolutely impermissible to grant the passive right to an inexpert youth. So this is basically the party direction board. Let's say the 7 most prominent functions. I managed also to find the larger, also the other part of direction. There were more or less in total 28 figures. I was unfortunately unable to find all of them, but still I think some features can be seen also with this other group. And this is actually that they are mainly born in Fiume, that maybe age could be also in this case understood as an important factor, but most of all, I would say the profession is interesting. So that there are some kind of port city professions, so connected with trade or connected with sea type of jobs, so marine jobs, maritime jobs, but there are also other professions. So jeweler, for instance, stone cutter, and so on. But what should not be also disregarded is that the party had the support of the dock workers. This is another quite complex story, but it's interesting to say, to think that it's not so almost a kind of professionals middle upper support, but there is also kind of opening towards the, or at least there is a support from other, let's say, class-based groups. So, and to try to be brief, what happens to this group after 1918? When the Nuncio occupies the city, Gottardi and some of these followers have to go to Zagreb. So they escape. Actually, the Gottardi house is devastated by the Nuncio legionnaires. Others are put under surveillance or are prosecuted. But what you would expect is that with the moment when an independent state is created, is that this group somehow manages to emerge as a political factor. This actually doesn't happen because between these two political blocs, which are created, the Italian nationalist bloc and the autonomist bloc led by the independentist bloc, basically, these autonomist Democrats who are not in good relations with the autonomous party because they feel that the leader of the autonomous party in the previous period was not sincerely interested for independence. They do not participate in the elections in the sense that they do not have their candidates. There are two exceptions, which again tell us something about, I would say, the importance of local, the understanding of local-based allegiances. I don't have time to explain you this part, but it's interesting that in suburbs, during the votes there were two different districts. In these suburbs, people, at least one figure who was active in politics before 1914, was part of this autonomous democratic party, managed still to maintain its position in this, become part of this constituent assembly, so managed to maintain a kind of position. What happens with the annexation of the city to Italy? Well, this group, I must say, these people are difficult to trace. There is what one can say is that from their obituaries, for those who deceded until basically 1943-45, we can see there is no institutional recognition in Italian Fiume. There are two exceptions for the judge Thierry and for the factor Director Volskin. This means that we can only see family obituaries with really basic information. Some of these people left the city, so as you can see, also people with a kind of skill which then were able to deploy somewhere else. Probably it could be said that they were uninterested in active politics because there is no political record, or that they have been completely marginalized. And Gottardi, as a figure who returns to live in Fiume as part of Italy, is described by the police as a relic of the past. Before the conclusion, I would just say that he was a relic of the past during the fascist period. But it's interesting that during the Nazi occupation in 1943, he tried to reactivate himself, and actually his plan was used by a collaborationist faction in order to find a new solution to the to the Nazi occupied city and nearby territories. So basically, to come up with a short conclusion with the hope of not being too banal, I would say, we could say that Gottardi had a kind of larger support, in the sense that nation state in Fiume did not simply prevail with October 1918 events. The notion of autonomy did not transform magically in nation state loyalty. Different events could trigger or reinforce certain forms of identification. A kind of open issue, I would say, is there a return of pre-politicized situation for some individuals? So in the sense that they are active in a short period of time and then they decide to not be active anymore. And the other interesting element definitely would be the role of pre-Habsburg local political social networks and allegiances, in the sense that it should be understood that some people who were already inside some circles prior to 1914 or 1918 were able to maintain this kind of influence or reuse it after 1918. I'm already out of time. Thank you very much. Let me put the mask.
Thank you very much for your presentation of the complex situation in Fiume. And now we can open the discussion. We already got two questions. Alexandra Piahanu, could you please repeat your question to Bela Bodo?
Hello, everybody. Professor Bela Bodo, I have a question for you. You replied briefly, but I would like to repeat it. So, in my understanding, the pre-war paramilitary groups in Hungary, especially the Bürger shooting clubs, had big discussions about the political identity and political loyalty should be loyal to the Habsburg dynasty and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in general, or only to the Hungarian Magyar nation. And I think maybe this discussion continues later, because we know 1921 some paramilitary groups joined Charles Habsburg during his return to Hungary, and some of them joined the Horthy forces. So I'm interested in the question how these discussions continue during the White Terror. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? Thank you for your question. This is a very important. When we think about Hungarian nationalism, we have to think about this obsession with the constitutional issue, independence from Austria, or what form of accommodation. So that's indeed the main issue at the turn of the century, especially around 1904, 1905. I was more interested in the continuity, though. Right? In 1918, this issue has been resolved. Hungary became an independent state. Hungarian nationalists got what they wanted. In a different shape and form, although it's a much smaller state. In regards to continuities, this is more fascinating. There's a fascinating individuals in the person of Semere, and also a continuity in regards to ideology and organizations. Right? When we talk about turn of the century, we talk about generational conflicts. The Wandervögel movement in Germany and similar movements in Europe, this rebellion of the bourgeois youth against the Readers. And this students' movement incorporated this, indeed embodied this generational revolts. But all what it meant with the notion of charismatic leadership, a kind of male bonding, nationalism, love of violence, or at least a different attitudes to violence. And most importantly, as I mentioned, is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has been on the rise, I think in the entire country, but definitely among male students at universities, exactly the same issues. It is as much about, I call it in my book, social positioning, right? Social positioning against Jews. So it's a competition within the middle class. So there are important continuities, but we also have to remember that the war changed everything. It indeed acted as a catalyst, and it changed student radicalism drastically. So there is a student unrest before 1918, but it's completely different after 1918. It became violent to the extreme. Now, this is fascinating, often neglected, how much role violence played in the passing of the numerus clausus legislation. Right? Did the numerus clausus legislation serve to rein in the militias, especially the students, or did it basically justified legalized student radicalism? Now the judgment is still out there, but we could argue that without student radicalism, the numerus clausus legislation would have probably not passed. Yeah.
Okay, and there was a second question from Victoria Serhienko. Could you please repeat your question?
Hello, of course, thank you very much for your presentation. And my question is, could you please say more deeply about the motivations for the White Terror against Jews? For instance, what was the role in the terror played views and ideas developed by Russian monarchists and nationalists at that time?
As I mentioned in my presentation, there was this, it's not my idea, Robert Gerwas is much better about this international right-wing subculture. And the Hungarian militias were part of this international right-wing subcultures. And one of the elements of this subculture was the belief in the existence of a worldwide Jewish conspiracy. Now, Jews did play an important role in revolutionary movements all over Europe, including the Russian Revolution and the Hungarian Council Republic. The majority of Jews, however, did not participate. Hungarian Jews, essentially, if you ask, it was more on the liberal and the liberal conservative side. And indeed, many of them supported the counter-revolution. So the story is somewhat different. Now, when it comes to direct contact, there is contact. General Denikin found refuge in Hungary. So Hungarians did pay attention. Hungarians did support the counter-revolution in Russia, at least indirectly, and they did support the Polish state-building effort and the Polish defense in 1920. In Warsaw, you will still find its remnants. So it is really fascinating about this international right-wing, this right-wing international. And indeed, there are overlaps, there are connections, but what separated them, in my opinion, were often more important. The Germans and Austrian right-wingers the Nazis tried to make connections to pro-Nazi and the rest. They did not see eye to eye on many issues, especially in regards to the fate of Austria. So many things separated them, but we have to remember these are nationalists, first and foremost nationalists. So, and international nationalism is somehow contradictory in some ways, right? Even though there are true overlaps in regards to the language, especially in regards to anti-Semitism. I was interested in personal continuities. For example, the presence of Russian revolutionaries in the Red Guards. There were very few, or almost zero. There were a few Ukrainian counter-revolutionaries in Hungary, so the personal connection is not very strong. So it is nothing like that. You have, for example, the Cheko in Russia, which is made up by this international, it's a totally, completely international organizations. Latvians are overrepresented. Hungarians are there too, right? In Hungary, the Lenin boys were entirely Hungarians. So there's not, but on the other hand, you will find Albanians both in the red and the white militias. You will find Bosnians in the Hejaz detachment. And you will find Austrians in the various white groups, especially in the Ostenburg detachment, or the Lehar detachment. There are many Hungarian ethnic Germans overrepresented both in the Lehar and Ostenburg detachment. So to make the story short, there are overlaps, but there are less, more at the level of ideology than in regards to direct contact.
Thank you very much. We have 4 new questions. Dominic Reel, please.
Hello. First, this has all been great, and I think there's a lot of parts of all the talks that work well together, an emphasis on where these people are coming from and where they're going, and really trying to understand what activism means. My question obviously is for Ivan, because I love his work. I really appreciated how you emphasized the social background and the money-making background of these autonomous democrats. And I wonder what the silence of their lives under fascism means about power and money. What's really going on here? Because usually you would assume ousted power holders or ousted money holders are going to be demonized in some way or replaced in some way. But how you're telling this, and you didn't have much time, so I actually just want to give you more time to tell me more, is why we're seeing these kind of local patriots who are trying to silence the ladies and the young, then getting very gingerly eldered out of power in fascism instead of kicked out of power in fascism. And I was also, just to connect with the other talks, how many of these people were Jewish? Is there any other things that link them besides their job? I'm assuming most of them were not in the war because they were older, so that they had gone through the war pretty much running the town. Do you think this might be a reason why they have a different way? Anyways, anything you can tell, but also what you think this all means about power and politics on the local level. Thank you.
I'll try.
Okay, I'll continue to wear the mask. You understand me with the mask? Yeah, okay. Okay, the last question, as far as I know, only one was Jewish. I mean, at least, again, the problem is I don't know how he self-identified himself, but in these police records, he said that he was of Jewish origins. The one who actually who moved to live in Trieste. Your other question was, what did these guys do during the war? This is a very good question. I have honestly no idea. As you know, it's difficult to trace this kind of people if you don't have documents which are produced by themselves in the kind of diaries or letters. But I'll think about actually where could I find something about this. I mean, the problem right now about this kind of research is I'm not sure if I come to a dead end or I should continue to dig even further, because I somehow got exhausted by the fact that I could not find their personal files during the fascist period. So it's difficult to think where to locate a person if you don't have any kind of information about them, or if you don't have any kind of documents produced by themselves. But regarding actually the biggest question, you're saying the money holders would be demonized, how they are silenced, how they are silencing Enoch called. I don't know. So my impression was, I mean, we have been discussing this already, and this is the fact that the new Italian state presence in Fiume was not so strong because of the fact that it was on the frontier. It was a city which was destroyed economically in the post-war period. So I think the Italian state didn't have the capacity, even the fascist state didn't have the human resources or the economic resources to be able completely to aside all these elements that at one moment were in the immediate post-war moment were against the Italian state. I mean, this is not, I mean, the example would be not the autonomous Democrats, but the autonomists. So people who were part of the Constitutional Assembly, who were in exile in a nearby territory, returned after the annexation, and some of them in the 30s have been reintegrated in the Fiume state service, or in a kind of state-owned facilities or state control. So I think that in this sense, probably some of them decided, let's say, some of these figures understood that the moment of creating a kind of non-nation state solution was over, and then they probably were not politically engaged, while on the other side, the state understood, as the state institutions at the local level understood, that they need this kind of human capital in order to be able to manage the periphery, because you probably didn't have other human resources to do it. But I would say, I mean, the other side is that they are probably not so, I mean, my impression is that they are not the most prominent, let's say, money makers in the town, these guys here. They are somewhere on the middle level, I would say. The real money owners are those who knew how to side. And they sided with the winning side.
Just a little follow-up. So does that mean that politics is as important as we've always thought it was in this time period in this part of the world, or that maybe politics wasn't as important as we usually think of it as in this time period in this part of the world?
Honestly, I don't want to exploit too much my time, and I'll say I don't have an answer to this question. should I continue to be like the informal chair when when I'm already here? Or...
Okay.
Okay, yeah, okay. Marco, you have a question. Let me unmute you. You
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi. Hello. Yeah, it's a question for you, obviously, and it's a kind of big question because at the beginning of your paper, you were asking yourself if there was a polarized political situation in post-absolute human. But in your conclusions, I couldn't really find a kind of answer to this question. So I would like to ask you if this polarization, if there was a polarization, was a product of the transitional process. And I would like also to ask you if this shift to pre-political positions in the interwar period could be also understood as a kind of a rejection of the post-war polarization. But okay, if I well understood, you don't have so many sources about that. But I try to push you towards this problem as well. Thank you.
No, I mean, in the sense it is, I mean, the question from the beginning would be, could we see the local scene as simply a political national polarized situation, in the sense that we have that, as in the historiography, you have at least in lots of part of national historiographies, you have this idea that there are only two possible political sidings, or on the one side or on the other side. Okay, someone mentions the socialists because, well, okay, they are internationalists. But I mean, the point here would be, I would say that they are not only the socialists and the two main political factions. There are also other political factions, and I hope somehow to, you know, during the presentation show that there are this kind of different sidings of the population. But I would agree with you that in a sense you have a stronger polarization, but not in the sense of maybe of Croatians versus Italians, maybe more fascists versus the others. And this is best, I would see the best way to see this is through the violence which happens in town after the departure of the nuncio. So what I think, for instance, in Gerwart work, you have a lot of the nuncio, but you don't have any information about what is happening in town after the departure of the nuncio. And the rates of violence, I would say, are quite more bigger after the nuncio leaves town. Because then you have this coup d'etat, you have the burning of the electoral ballots. So you have a kind of radicalization, I would say, of this local fascist group, which, and you have reported it. I mean, at the end, the Italian state has to intervene with the military governor in this official independent state to create some kind of order in a economically devastated town, but also town with I mean, violence in the sense of people who are killed, but also, I mean, I found in police files people who are dressed as soldiers or as police officers come knocking at the door of someone who they consider a political opponent. Okay, so I'll mute myself. Jerne, you will probably have to come here and ask the question to Tamas, and I'll move myself.
Thank you, Tamas, for this illuminating and thought-provoking and excellent presentation. I mean, and also a very refreshing one after 3 weeks of dramatic accounts regarding the Carinthian plebiscite in the Slovene public. But I mean, from your presentation, I could digest that it doesn't only deconstruct a Carinthian, you know, this inclusive regional mythology, but also a grand Slovene master narrative, namely of Carinthia as a birthplace of Slovenes and so on and so forth. So your data is really telling in this regard, and I would like to ask you if you could elaborate a bit on this Heimwehr local troops from Slavophone or bilingual villages and communities. Do you have any numbers? How many people actually took up arms? Do you have any personal accounts regarding this? But I mean, it's quite logical given that the Slovene liberators came directly from this way, you know, this the most important roads that connected Carniola and Carinthia. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Actually, the main problem with the source is that there are some, so the kind of Austrian public administrations worked relatively well, I would say. In 1918, they continued this Habsburg tradition to administer the soldiers using actually the old charts. The problem is that they mostly question their language knowledge. And all of them wrote German. So theoretically, every soldiers who we have record spoke German in the Carinthian Upper Khan. But many of them wrote also the Slovene language as well. So what we can only say that how many people fight in the Austrian side who spoke Slovenian. Actually, that's what the data is about. But if we compare, for example, this Rosenthal case of Heimwehr Battalion, where 85% of them spoke Slovenian, we know the pre-war census that these places were mostly populated by people who spoke Slovenian. We can basically deduce that was most probably what we can say they were Slovenian soldiers. So actually, where the data came from is two main sources. One is the so-called Kärtner-Kreuz recipients. In the 1920s and 30s, every participant of the Abwehrkampf received this Kärtner-Kreuz. And there is a database actually compiled by the Nazis during the Second World War, which includes all the names. And the second is the personal forms which were filled upon their enlistment to the different companies. And this includes, for example, the spoken language, their social background, and their place of birth, place of residence, and so forth. So that's where the sources are coming from, if I understood your question correctly.
Sorry, again me. No, I had the question for Tamas actually. So the question involved the data you are using and proceeding and then creating this kind of graphs. I was wondering, I mean, when you create the data about the places of where these people were coming from, are you using military sources and so basically they're Heimatrecht or something else? Because I'm wondering how much of the official Heimatrecht could be telling about where these people were coming from, in the sense what was their everyday experience, in a sense. Because I mean, okay, I'm thinking of another type of sources. I have been working with workers in Fiume, and it's interesting that they, for example, they listed the place they were coming without, I mean, saying if this place is Heimatrecht or this place is where they were living before but had Heimatrecht somewhere else. So the question would be, in the sense it regards mobility. So how much does Heimatrecht, in this sense, if it is Heimatrecht, tell us about what was the spatial background of these people?
The answer is a little bit twofold, because there are some sources who only indicate the place of birth. And there are some sources who indicate place of birth as well as the place of residence, or the place of residence of the closest relative, which I assume more or less probably the same, or could be the same. And what we can see is actually an absolutely right. We can trace back a kind of migration inside the Habsburg Empire, because if you can remember the chart, very close to to Lower Austria, there is Moravia and Bohemia, which is, I mean, about 5% of the soldiers are coming from there, which could be surprising because it's relatively far away. Why these people are in these local conflicts, and the answer, I think, is very clear, because they are mostly industrial workers who are arriving from these regions to Carinthia, and this is a result of an inner migration, most probably before 1918. So I would say there are sources for both. In a case of Gärtnerkreuz, I think it was the place of residence which was indicated, which of course not probably the best one, but the only one we have. So I agree with you that we should consider these factors as well when looking these graphics or these statistics.
Well, thank you. I don't know, do we have still time, or we have time?
And I also have something.
Would you like to go first, or should we?
Well, let's. I mean, it's sort of.
Dominic,
whom would you like? Dominic, whom would you like to ask? Because I have something to Tomasz. Maybe it's better to. Okay, thanks. So thank you, Tomasz. It's always fascinating to learn more about certain aspects of your book and work at every new paper you present. I have something to comment and also a question. I would start with a comment, and this is about the Székely mythology and the Székely Hadosztály, actually the institutional form. You were rightly saying that the Székely mythology is more exclusive, and it positions the Székelys as a kind of very special, authentic Hungarian bearers of national purity. But on the other hand, the Székely Hadosztály association itself was very inclusive in this sense. The weirdest figure I know from the Hadosztály is someone who was born in near Arad, in Lipova, who was almost insane, I would say, but a very strange figure. So he had no connections whatsoever with Székelys, and still he was the cashier of the association from 1938 or something like that. So at one point, it was not about Székelys anymore, but self-attribution of some kind of mythical Hungarian national identity. And the question is regards this kind of political use, because it's very typical for using that kind of juxtaposition of a more authentic national identity with a less authentic, less pure one for political reasons. And in the case of the Székelys, it was harder in interwar Hungary because there was no political sovereignty of Hungary over the Székely counties. So the point of using it as a leverage against the central government was not much. But in the case of Austria, there was a new state, and I'm sure that these regions and Länder actually competed for resources. And I'm interested in how much the Carinthians used it, and also how it was related to the existing form of a similar existing form of national purity based on the idea of armed defense of this time the emperor, but also it could be easily transferred to Austria, the Tyrol variety.
Yes, so I think that what you mentioned about the Székely Division Association, which was the kind of veteran association of the interwar period, using or promoting this kind of Transylvanian sacred mythology or warrior type of this sacred mythology. I think the best example for the political use of this constructed local identity are two parallel figures: the two heads of the head of the Székely Division, Károly Kratochvíl, who was, from his name, coming from a most probably a Czech origin family, a military family actually, who was constructing himself as a true Transylvanian because he served, I think he attended some of the military schools in Transylvania, but in the interwar period, he positioned themselves as a Transylvanian, as a true representative of the Székely. So a very good example how many people actually jumped into this kind of exclusive narrative, forgetting their origins or identifying with this regional identity. And in Carinthia, actually, during the Ständestaat, the head of the province was Ludwig Hülgert, who was the commander of the Carinthian troops during the Abwehrkampf, who was born, I think, in Vienna. He was a typical career officer, so had nothing to do actually with Carinthia, but he also made himself as the true representative of the local people. And in the case of Carinthia, what I can see, this kind of idea of national purity and borderland in relation to Tyrol, this is, so we are, I'm recorded via, it won't hopefully go to any Carinthian national television. So I think there is a little bit of an inferiority complex to Tyrol. So they try to kind of argue that, yes, we are like Tyrol. We are also a very true German borderland region, and we are like them. We have Gärtner Schützen, like the Tyrolean Schützen. So I think this kind of Tyrolean regional identity, warrior borderland identity influences the Carinthians pretty much and very strongly, and always relate to this when they are referring to their own heroic historical borderland traditions.
So, Dominic.
That was really fascinating. I think my question is a follow-up to Ivan's question about the Kettenakreuz. In looking at the Legionnaires, and they were all given, you know, money and awards afterwards for Fiume, it's been very fascinating looking at who had to prove well that they were really there or really did something, and who had to give less proof. And I'm wondering if in the Kettenakreuz there was a higher chance that certain kind of people already knew they would get it, or was it really very professional in how it was treated? So I'm wondering if the data that is created using the Kettenakreuz is constructed data in a way that you took into account, or anyways, just more about how that data was created.
Yeah, actually, when they introduced the Kettenakreuz, the method was copied from the Karl Truppenkreuz. Actually, it looked the same. So it was, if you wish, a little bit military administratory decision. Of course, I think at that time the Social Democrats had still massive influence on the provincial politics, and there was, especially in 1913, there was a massive competition between the local Social Democrats and the local German nationalists, who is the real freedom fighter. But I think at the creation of the Kettenakreuz, or the awarding the Kettenakreuz, was a very kind of inclusive, if you wish, democratic or inclusive way of awarding this kreuz. Not necessarily because the people who are in charge were so democratic or so tolerant, but because they are following the patterns of the Karl Truppenkreuz, and that was it. There was two types of them: a military dienst and a civilian variant. But I would say most likely there was not that much of a discrimination, if you wish, except of course urbans are overrepresented because they were more connected to generally to the state administration. But the data is, generally speaking, the data is very similar what I saw in the military enlistment records. So probably you are right. There should be some bias or some change because how it is collected. I think we will never know it. That's my honest answer.
Okay, so thank you very much for this wonderful papers and for the vivid discussion afterward.